parliamentarians particularly for inviting us. So we've heard a bit about, in the last 2 days, about the pandemic agenda, obviously, in the WHO treaty and the amendments to the International Health Regulations, or IHR, and particularly their impact on sovereignty, which is all very real. I'd like to take a bit of a step back and look at this from a public health point of view. So the entire idea behind these, the IHR amendments and the proposed treaty, are based on a series of basic assumptions about WHO in particular and pandemics, that WHO is a legitimate representative of the world's populations, is a legitimate custodian of public health, is a credible responder to health emergencies, and that pandemics are an increasing and existential threat. And if any of those don't make sense, then the whole treaty process and the IHR amendments don't make sense. So just want to go briefly through the evidence for these. And the WHO started, this is paraphrase here, but as a fairly benign organisation, the general idea from most people starting it was to serve countries when requested, addressing the highest burdens of disease for people most in need, which tends to be high-burden diseases in low-income populations. And it was funded by core assessed funding from countries, which meant that countries, according to GDP, gave money to WHO. WHO decided how best to use that based on these general principles for the greater good. And it was based on a sensible, holistic view of health, both physical, mental and social well-being, not merely the presence of a virus. So this has changed for a number of reasons, and one of the big ones we can see in the WHO budget. This is a current budget. The original idea of core contributions that WHO would use is now a tiny red bit up the top there, and the green is voluntary specified contributions, which are essentially, it's about 75% of the budget, and specified means that the funder gives the money for a certain project that's specified by the funder. So essentially WHO has moved from a technical agency to a tool for funders to do what the funder wants, or essentially a gun for hire. And the other big change is in where the funding comes from. So the USA is the largest. The second largest is a private funder. Gavi, number 4, is a public-private partnership controlled quite directly by private interests, specifically vaccine corporations and the Gates Foundation. The European Commission, number 5, is not a democratic institution. I think most people would agree. So we have very heavy private funding, and the two countries that are big funders two of the big vaccine investors, and Germany, not surprisingly, is a big investor in BioNTech. So that's significant to where we go now. And I want to look quickly at what happened in COVID-19. And before COVID-19, late 2019, WHO put out its pandemic influenza guidelines or recommendations. And these are important. They're based on orthodox public health. They're essentially the Great Barrington Declaration, and it says the same thing. But this is from WHO directly, and it says not recommended under any circumstances: contact tracing, quarantine of exposed individuals, so people who are not sick, entry or exit screening, or border closures. And the reason for this is because they have very little effect, and they will disproportionately harm particularly low-income populations. And they envisioned that in a really serious epidemic or pandemic, you might close workplaces for 7 to 10 days to get hospitals ready, but beyond that, it was going to be a net harm. So this was the WHO position officially in 2019. So 2020, this is published in The Lancet in March, so we knew very early on that COVID was a pandemic that almost exclusively affected old people. This is the data from China, published by Imperial College, strangely, in The Lancet. So Imperial College was very clear on this as well. It will almost never affect children or healthy working age people. So with that in mind, and looking at the population pyramid, so China on the left, Europe on the right, very similar. In the middle, on the right is Africa. And if we look at those over 75, there's a substantial number in China and Europe. There's less than 1% of people in Africa are over 75 years old, 50% are under 20. So we knew very early on in 2020 that Africa would essentially be spared, most countries, from COVID-19. And they also have lower obesity rates. And the exceptions are the northern Mediterranean countries and South Africa, where people are older and have higher obesity. So 1.3 billion people in Africa were not at risk. So knowing that, the World Economic Forum, big part of the WHO, started the ball rolling with Africa being a time bomb. We're going to have a catastrophe. The Guardian joins in, and medical journals join in that are funded by the same people, private funders of WHO. So what was being published was that because Sub-Saharan Africa was poorer, they're going to have a disaster from COVID, even though everyone, including WHO, knew that wasn't the case. What actually happened, we have the UK, Germany, US here, and 6 African countries along the bottom. You can barely see them in sort of early 21, and then they disappear. There is almost no reported deaths in most Sub-Saharan African countries, tiny number. So that completely fits with what we expected from the virus. And in the first 13 months of COVID, the little orange bit in life is lost in Sub-Saharan Africa, compared in the same year to tuberculosis, malaria and HIV, which were actually increasing at the time, which were the traditional priorities of the World Health Organization. So despite that, WHO pushed very hard for lockdowns in Africa, closed schools, closed workplaces, closed clinics, or strongly advocated for this. In South Asia, similar type of people, UNICEF looked at just in 2022, because of these measures in South Asia, about 250,000 children died, not from COVID, but from lockdowns. About 420 million out of school, over 400,000 additional teenage pregnancies. Overall, globally, we had 100 million extra children in poverty, 200,000 stillbirths. There's going to be another 10 million, up to 10 million girls forced into child marriage due to school closures, poverty, etc. And the World Bank estimates about 100 additional people in extreme poverty. So this is the outcome of ignoring everything we knew about COVID from early 2020 in low-income countries. So despite that, the vaccines came 2021, and WHO decided with their COVAX program to vaccinate the world. And they did an important study in 2021 across a number of regions of Africa. This is a WHO study. They found that in the third quarter, about 65% of people in Africa had positive antibodies against SARS-CoV-2. So almost everyone was already immune. They'd been exposed. This was before Omicron went through Africa. So with this immune population, very few old people, tiny burden of COVID, they introduced the most expensive public health program in history, international program, with a budget of about $10 billion to vaccinate 70% of people in low-income countries. In comparison, the WHO budget is about $3 billion. We spend $3 billion in total on malaria that kills about 600,000 children every year. So this is based on the slogan, "No one is safe until everyone is safe," which you will have heard. So if no one is safe, what this is trying to say is if you vaccinate some people, they're not safe until you vaccinate the rest. So the vaccine, according to WHO, doesn't work to protect anyone, because if you're vaccinated, you still have to have other people vaccinated. But we know, and WHO knows, that it doesn't stop transmission. So the slogan that this program is based on is, is ludicrous, essentially. So, if the slogan is completely false, we need to question the program. But we have UNICEF, Gavi, CEPI, the UN in general, all behind this program, partners in it. So no one in Africa, no one in low-income countries essentially would have gained from this, but other people clearly did gain. And this takes us back to the funding of WHO and the private investment. So where do we go now? The pandemic preparedness agenda. And going back to this 2019 document, the WHO lists what they consider to be pandemics in the last 100 years, pre-COVID. So we had the Spanish flu, where most people died, as we've already heard, due to a lack of antibiotics from secondary bacterial infections. So that won't happen now. Then there's in the late 50s and late 60s, there were flu outbreaks, killed about 1 million people, which compares with about 1.5 million people that die every year from tuberculosis. So in the last century pre-COVID, we haven't had a bad pandemic. So that's the frequency. And, we hear a lot about increasing outbreaks in the last decade or two. So SARS in 2003 killed 840 people. And cancer just in the EU kills 3,500 every day. So, the outbreaks we've had in the last 20 years are essentially irrelevant from a disease burden standpoint. So we have, despite all this, the main effort of WHO now the main concentration is on pandemics. So the International Health Regulations, very briefly, we've heard these already, but it's a legally binding document. It essentially makes recommendations into requirements for countries, so that's how it affects sovereignty. It sets up a surveillance network. Rather than having a demonstrated threat, they just need rather than having actual harm, they need just a threat in order to designate an emergency. And they have censorship to stop you from complaining about it. The treaty or accord is essentially the governance and financing for the IHR amendments, a supply chain, and again censorship. And the IHR amendments almost certainly go ahead. It's unclear whether the treaty will go ahead, I think, in a few months' time. If it doesn't, it's not going to make a lot of difference, as we'll see, because there's a lot of other alternative ways to fund this process. So, in addition to these, so the focus of the WHO is completely on this. They have three others: the medical countermeasures, PrEP, and the emergency medical team strategy. So there's a huge effort within WHO just on pandemics. And globally, they're looking for an additional $10 billion every year, which is 3 times the current WHO budget. So this is in the context of essentially something that doesn't affect the disease or the people that WHO we thought was there for. So to summarise the WHO side, really it's, the ownership is wrong. It's directed by private individuals and corporations. There's a conflict of interest. And, that 50% of the member states are not democracies or don't claim to be democracies. So it makes no sense from a democratic point of view to put power into this organisation. It has a very poor track record. Less expertise than most countries in this. It's a bureaucracy, not a technical agency. And the idea of having highly centralised control of a very complex situation like a real pandemic also makes no sense. The populations are heterogeneous. You need a heterogeneous and locally based response. So it's not just WHO that's doing this. Could I grab some water? Water? Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So this isn't just WHO, this is a whole movement that we're dealing with. So we have, okay, I'll be quick. A whole lot of institutions behind this. And what is happening, we have this, thank you. This is really the work of public-private partnerships. So what happens in a public-private partnership, which is the new model for international health? We have these private corporations, they partner with government taxpayer money does most of the funding, the corporations look after the modelling to make sure there's a problem, they look after the media sponsorship, and we end up with a commodity-based public health that will make money for the private interests. And that's the reason why private interests go into public-private partnerships. So in the case of health emergencies or pandemic in general, we're going to surveil for variants. We'll find them because in nature we have viral variants. We're setting up a huge surveillance network with this $10 billion. WHO will declare a risk. They'll lock down. We'll have a 100-day vaccine from CEPI, which will give people their freedom back if they get vaccinated, and then we'll surveil and find more variants. This will be run by public money and it'll produce private profit. And there's salaries and jobs, all the future of global health, international public health is in this, is running it. So there's a huge bureaucracy who are going to run this because that's where you go now if you're in public health.